essentially on Instagram, like last week, I asked people to submit their biggest sort of fashion hot takes, like their craziest opinions on fashion. And at some point next week or the week after, I'm going to sort of react to a few of them and post that on the channel. And then when I was reading people's hot takes, I started to think to myself, do I have a fashion hot take? And I was really thinking, I was like, what are my like craziest fashion hot takes? And then I thought of a hot take that I have thought for a while. And essentially, the hot take is that Christian Dior is overrated, which I know is a crazy hot take. But obviously, this is a podcast episode, so it's not like a YouTube video where I have to summarize things. I can actually really say my thoughts on why I think Christian Dior is overrated. Now, Christian Dior is an iconic designer. There's no sort of not saying that. Obviously, Christian Dior is famous for the new look, and this, just to start with already, what Christian Dior is known for, which is the new look. Obviously, he made things like the bar suit, and like he's known for a lot of other things. But the first big moment was the new look, and I'm sure everyone knows the story of the new look. If you don't, after the World War and during the World War, actually, fashion was sort of rationed because obviously during wartime things were scarce, and so therefore a lot of designers were using a lot less fabric to make their clothing. Clothing was a lot less elaborate. But then after the World War, Christian Dior was sort of frustrated with the fact that, because he sees Parisian fashion as, you know, the height of couture and stuff like that. So he was really pissed off at the fact that, you know, people were not, you know, designing things to their full potential because of they were trying to ration fabric and be sort of, you know, frugal with the fabrics. And so he made these decadent, opulent silhouettes that used loads of fabric, like tons. And it was crazy at the time. And I think the creation of the new look, it was more famous because of the timing of it, more so than it being original. Because I've done a lot of research on designers like Christian Dior and Cristobal Balenciaga. And when you do research on these things, you realize that Cristobal Balenciaga designed something extremely similar 10 years before that. And so, first of all, my first gripe with the new look is the new look wasn't original. But what made the new look is the fact that the timing of it. It was using, it was being opulent and decadent with the use of fabrics at a time when everyone was trying to ration fabrics. And it was against sort of the fashion of the time, because you had people like Coco Chanel who were liberating the women, as people say. You have people like Diana Vreeland who said that Chanel sort of liberated women because she was making clothes for women and it was designed by a woman at a time when a lot of couturiers were men. And Chanel was, you know, making clothing that was comfortable for women to wear, like a uniform, everyday wear almost. And Christian Dior almost put women back into like these heavy corsets and things like that. But my first gripe with Christian Dior is that at the start of Christian Dior's career, I wouldn't say he's the most original designer. And it's quite interesting because, of course, Christian Dior said that Cristobal Balenciaga is the master of us all, which means that he's definitely inspired by Cristobal Balenciaga, and it's clear if you look at a lot of Christian Dior's work. And then further into his career, when Yves Saint Laurent became involved in the Atelier, Yves Saint Laurent was a big influence on the designs that Christian Dior would make, and a lot of the designs that supposedly Christian Dior designed were actually designed by Yves Saint Laurent. So that's my second gripe. It's like a lot of what we praise Christian Dior for, Yves Saint Laurent, especially at the latter stages of the brand of before Christian Dior's unfortunate passing, a lot of it can be attributed to Yves Saint Laurent. And then on top of that, Christian Dior was not like, he wasn't a hands-on designer. So he had a lot of really creative ideas, but he wasn't like an Alexander McQueen who could make crazy patterns and sew in creative ways. And so I just think that when you're talking about the greatest designers of all time, I think to be one of the greatest designers of all time, it's way more than just you had a few moments, or people have created a big narrative. I think you have to be good at everything. I think you have to be a great designer that's good with your hands, that could sew, that can tailor, that had the big moments, that created silhouettes, that influenced a lot of people in fashion. And there are many people that I can say are that, like Cristobal, Balenciaga, or people like Alexander McQueen. So when I think of greatest designers of all time, I can never really think of Christian Dior, because there's so many designers that I think are better than Christian Dior, like Rei Kawakubo or Yohji Yamamoto. These are people with the practical skill when it comes to the sewing and the tailoring and the pattern making, and then also the creative ideas, and also the influence and the fashion moments. And I think a lot of the time in fashion, especially the big couturiers around that time, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, it was all narrative. It was, so how the new look was coined. There was a woman called Carmel Snow, and she was the editor at Harper's Bazaar. And so she had a lot of power. That was at the height of Harper's Bazaar. That was when Harper's Bazaar was like iconic, right? And, you know, she said about Christian Dior's collection, because she really liked it. She was like, oh, it's a new look. And she was the one who coined the term, the new look, that obviously everyone went and ran with. And so she helped Christian Dior in a way that she named it something that gave it a narrative that we now remember. And I think a lot of fashion in that time period is just narrative. I wouldn't say, and once again, it's not like I'm saying Christian Dior is not a great designer. I started by saying he's iconic. But when we talk about the greats of the greats, Christian Dior just can't be on my list. And that's why I say this is like one of my biggest fashion hot takes, because I think a lot of people, I'm not saying I think so deeply about fashion, but I think a lot of people don't, once someone is seen as a great, if you say anything negative about them, they're like, oh, you don't know anything about fashion. How can you, Christian Dior's a great, what are you talking about? I don't think they're thinking critically. And another thing I think about, just when I think of couturiers, even though like Cristobal Balenciaga I think is fantastic and one of the best couturiers of all time, I still think that, you know, European fashion, especially fashion in France, what they had going for them was that they had the ability to document their fashion. And so a lot of the fashion magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar at the time were covering a lot of this fashion. So a lot of these creations were covered, whereas a lot of things weren't. And so because not many things were covered, because it wasn't social media where everyone is filming everything, therefore the people that were lucky enough to have their things covered are the ones that I just talked about. I feel like if you went back in that time, there were people that were creating things just as interesting as, let's say, a Cristobal Balenciaga or Christian Dior, but they weren't afforded the luxury or the privilege to be in the positions that, let's say, a Christian Dior or Karl Lagerfeld or an Yves Saint Laurent were put in, because every single couturier that's great from around that time, there's an association to, you know, high society. And how many people can be associated with high society? So unlike Cristobal Balenciaga, he wasn't necessarily from a rich family, but he, there was a lady, I've forgotten her name. There was a woman who, he designed he copied a Paul Poiret dress for. She was like one of his neighbors. She was really rich, and she was like one of his early patrons in his career. And so that was his into fashion. So a lot of people that were, even Elsa Schiaparelli, for example, she was from quite a well-to-do family. So a lot of these designers, these couturiers, they were just afforded the fact that they were associated with high society and they had loads of resources. I do think that during that time, there were many different designers, because Paris is not the only place that fashion was happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. We have no idea what was going on, let's say, in Africa, in African countries at that time. And there could be designers that were inventing silhouettes just as much as these designers were, but that stuff just wasn't covered. And so as much as I respect the work of couturiers like Christian Dior, who I do think is kind of overrated, and then people that I don't think are overrated, like a Schiaparelli or Balenciaga or Alexander McQueen, but Alexander McQueen is more recent. Let's just stick to Cristobal Balenciaga and like Elsa Schiaparelli, for example. They, once again, it's still this high society association, the fact that they were covered because they were in the right market and born in the right place, in the right family, at the right time. So yeah, it's just like, I wonder if we had social media in the 40s and 50s, how great we would view Christian Dior, when we would have been able to see so many other designers who, let's say, didn't have the high society associations. We would have been able to see their work because everyone would have just been filming everything if social media was a thing there at that time. Sorry. So yeah, it really, really makes me think, like, should we afford these couturiers that much respect? Like, oh my God, they're so great, when they were just lucky, right place, right time, and what they made was covered, versus thousands of designers who are making stuff just as good, but their stuff just wasn't covered by Vogue and Harper's Bazaar because they weren't at the right place at the right time. So yeah, that's kind of me breaking down my biggest hot take on why I think Christian Dior is overrated. And a lot of people don't actually know what overrated means. Overrated doesn't mean someone's bad. Someone can be amazing and still be overrated. Overrated just means they are afforded more credit than they are due. So in my opinion, I think Christian Dior is given more credit for his work than I think his work warrants. But it doesn't still mean I don't think he's made a massive impact in fashion, and a lot of his creations were iconic. So yeah, let me know what you think about me rambling on about my biggest fashion hot take.